The needle was still in the wall. Procurement Officer Velsath noticed it on his third sweep of the abandoned facility, a human medical implement, barely 4 centimeters long, embedded in the plaster at chest height as though someone had simply pressed it there and walked away. No blood, no sign of struggle. The door behind him hung open on its hinges, undamaged. The equipment inside was intact. The lights still worked. Everything about this building suggested the humans had left calmly. Everything about that needle suggested they had not. Velsath logged the image and moved on because the Dominion had cities to catalog and a planet to process. There were 17,000 facilities on this continent alone, and every single one of them had been abandoned in the same impossible way, not fled, not evacuated under fire, but simply vacated, orderly, almost welcoming. He filed the needle under anomaly, low priority. He would spend the rest of his life regretting that decision. The Dominion had not expected resistance. That much was true, and they were proud of saying so. What they did not say, what the official record would later redact, was that they had not expected this. 3 weeks before Velsath found that needle, the Dominion fleet had entered Earth's solar system, broadcasting on every frequency humanity used for communication. The message was standard, translated into 41 of Earth's primary languages, legally precise in a way that was almost gentle. You are being incorporated. Non-compliance is not an available option. Resistance will be addressed proportionally. The humans had responded on a single frequency, in a single language, with a message so short that the fleet's linguistics AI flagged it as possibly corrupt. "Come in, we've been expecting something like you." Fleet Admiral War had read it twice. Then she had summoned her senior strategist, Arch Commander Den, to her bridge and shown him the message on the main display. "They're bluffing," Den said immediately. "They have no orbital defense grid," War agreed. "No military satellites. The largest weapons platforms we can detect are surface-based, ground-side, and none of them are aimed at us." "Surrender posturing," Den said. "They're trying to appear cooperative to receive better incorporation terms." War nodded slowly. She stared at the message for another moment. "We've been expecting something like you." "Begin approach," she said. "Standard pacification protocol." The fleet moved inward without a single shot fired. Dominion landing craft touched down in 63 cities simultaneously. The streets were empty. The infrastructure was intact and powered. Food stores were stocked. Water treatment was running. In 14 of the 63 cities, the landing coordinates had been cleared of vehicles and obstacles as though someone had specifically prepared landing zones. 3 mysteries presented themselves to the Dominion's analysts within the first 18 hours, and none of them were the ones anyone had been looking for. The first, every communications hub on Earth had been shut down from the inside, not destroyed. The hardware was intact. The software had been cleanly disabled. Whoever had done it knew exactly which components to touch, and they had done it in an organized sequence that suggested coordination across the entire planet. The Dominion Signals team estimated the operation would have required hundreds of thousands of humans acting in concert, simultaneously, within a 4-hour window. The second, the hospitals were empty, but the medical records were not. Every patient file, every treatment log, every surgical note had been printed on physical paper and left in organized stacks. Not shredded, not burned, stacked, as if the humans wanted the Dominion to read them. The third, the needle in the wall. Velsath's needle, and the 11,000 others like it found in similar positions across similar facilities in similar cities. Always chest height, always embedded cleanly, never accompanied by blood or struggle. The analysts noted all 3, categorized them as low to medium priority, moved on. The planet was enormous, and there were so many more important things to understand first. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Vasquez had been underground for 9 days before she stopped counting. The chamber was 40 meters beneath a former industrial site in what had been central Spain. Around her sat 11 other people, 2 engineers, a doctor, a linguist, 3 soldiers besides herself, and 3 civilians who had been recruited specifically because they spoke Mandarin, Russian, and Arabic. The linguist, a small man named Faris who wore glasses he'd repaired 4 times with duct tape, had been the one to first suggest they might need people who could speak to each other in languages the Dominion hadn't fully cataloged yet. "You're assuming they'll try to eavesdrop on us," Elena had said, when Faris first made the pitch 6 months earlier. "I'm assuming they're intelligent," Faris had replied, which means yes. She'd put him on the list. Now she was watching him sit cross-legged on a folding cot, eating a protein bar with the absolute concentration of a man who had decided that if this was going to be his life for the foreseeable future, he was going to be present for every moment of it. The bar was cheese-flavored. He'd been clear about having cheese-flavored. He ate it anyway. "How long do you think before they notice the pattern?" one of the engineers, Kowalski, asked, not looking up from the map he was annotating. "They already noticed it," Elena said. "The question is whether they understood it. They're a spacefaring civilization. So were we, almost." She tapped the map where Kowalski was working. "Being smart enough to travel between stars doesn't mean you're smart enough to understand something you've never needed to understand before." The chamber had no name. It existed on no Dominion survey. Above them, the industrial site had been stripped to its concrete bones 6 months before the Dominion arrived, stripped deliberately, so that there was nothing above worth scanning deeply for. The heat signature of 12 humans living 40 meters down was masked by the geothermal venting system they'd retrofitted from the site's old cooling infrastructure. Faris looked up from the cheese bar. "You know what I keep thinking about?" "Don't," Elena said. "The way they landed." "Faris, they used our coordinates." He set the bar down. "Not their own calculations, ours. They landed where we cleared space for them to land, which means they were reading our activity in the weeks before arrival, and they either didn't recognize what the clearing was for, or they recognized it and decided it wasn't a threat," Elena finished. "Yeah, I know." Silence for a moment. The geothermal vent hummed. "Which one is scarier?" Kowalski asked quietly. Nobody answered, because nobody wanted to say it out loud. The second one. The second one was scarier by an enormous distance, because if the Dominion had seen what humanity was doing in those final weeks and decided it wasn't worth worrying about, then humanity was either far more clever than the Dominion realized, or far more pathetic. They were counting on it being the first one. They were very aware it might be the second. Arch-Commander Den had been conducting what the Dominion called compliance interviews for 11 days, and he had developed a persistent headache that no medication seemed to touch. The humans who presented themselves for interviews, and they did present themselves, walking into the Dominion's processing centers in small groups, calm, apparently cooperative, answered questions with a consistency that should have been reassuring. They explained where population centers were. They identified infrastructure systems. They described governmental structures in accurate detail. They never lied. As far as Dominion interrogation technology could determine, they told the truth in every measurable way. And yet, where is your military leadership? Den asked the woman across the table from him. She was perhaps 50 years old, with gray at her temples and the kind of stillness that Den had learned, across many invasions, meant either submission or something much worse. "Dead," she said. "All of them. The ones that would have mattered, yes." Den leaned forward. "You're telling me your entire military command structure was eliminated before we arrived?" "I'm telling you that the people who would have made decisions that endangered civilian lives are no longer in a position to make those decisions." She met his eyes steadily. "That's not quite the same thing." Den stared at her. The interrogation AI at his side showed zero deception markers. She was telling the truth. Who made that decision? He asked. A lot of people, she said, together. He filed the report as military command decapitation, cause unclear, possibly internal conflict. His superiors accepted that explanation because it was the simplest one and they were busy. What none of them paused to consider was the specific phrasing the woman had used. Not our military leadership died. Not there was a conflict asterisk. She had said, the ones that would have mattered. Someone had made a very careful, very deliberate decision about which humans needed to not be in charge when the Dominion arrived. The headache behind Den's eyes intensified. The first misinterpretation cost the Dominion 3 weeks. Dominion engineers attempting to restore the communications network found the hardware cleanly intact and the disabling elegant, far more elegant than they'd expected from a civilization at humanity's apparent technological level. Their initial assessment: this must have been done by a small group of specialists, probably working from a central hub. They spent 22 days searching for the hub. There was no hub. There had never been a hub. The operation had been distributed across 11,000 locations, executed by people who had been trained specifically for this task over the preceding 8 months. Truck drivers, teachers, a retired electrician named Huang Wei who had watched 47 tutorial videos and practiced on a simulator in his garage. When the Dominion finally understood what they were looking at, the senior signals analyst filed a report that her superiors initially refused to believe. This was not coordinated by specialists, the report read. This was coordinated by ordinary humans who chose to become specialists for a specific purpose and then executed without error. Time frame: 4 hours. Participants: estimated 300,000 individuals acting without direct communication in the final stages. The question nobody was ready to ask: if 300,000 ordinary humans had trained themselves to do something that precise, in 8 months, without anyone noticing, what else had they trained themselves to do? Far below the industrial site in Spain, Elena Vasquez received the signal she'd been waiting for. Not a radio signal, not digital. A pattern of very specific power fluctuations in the regional grid, fluctuations that looked like nothing more than load variance but encoded, for people who knew exactly what to read, a single piece of information. Phase 1 complete. They're looking in the wrong place. She exhaled, pressed her palm flat against the stone floor of the chamber, felt the cold of it. Okay, she said quietly, Phase 2. The medical records had been the second misinterpretation, and it was more damaging than the first. Dominion medical analysts, tasked with understanding humanity's biological vulnerabilities, spent 2 weeks reading through the patient files left behind in the hospitals. What they found was genuinely alarming, not because human biology was unusually fragile, but because the records documented, in extraordinary clinical detail, how much suffering a human body could sustain and continue functioning. Surgical files, recovery logs, physical therapy notes, pain tolerance documentation, psychological resilience assessments after trauma, case after case after case of humans who had been broken, bones, organs, minds, and repaired themselves through combinations of medical intervention, and something the files described with a clinical term that the Dominion's translator first rendered as asterisk determination, and then, after 3 recalibrations, rendered as asterisk refusal. Refusal of what? Asked the junior analyst reviewing the translations. The senior analyst looked at the word for a long time. Refusal to accept the body's conclusion, she said finally. The misinterpretation was this. The Dominion read the medical records as a gift, as proof that humans wanted to be understood, wanted cooperation, wanted to be seen as manageable. They read the detailed documentation of human pain and recovery as vulnerability assessment generously provided by a compliant species. It did not occur to them until much later that someone had specifically chosen which records to leave behind. That out of billions of patient files, a selection had been made, curated, organized, stacked, and that the selection criteria had not been make us appear cooperative. The selection criteria had been, show them exactly what we can survive. Alina had been the one to give that instruction 8 months earlier, in a meeting that had lasted 6 hours and left everyone in the room exhausted and slightly sick with what they were planning. They'll read it as a sign of openness. The woman who was now pretending to cooperate with Den's interviews had said. She was a bioethicist. She had objected to 7 parts of the plan before agreeing to the 8th. They'll see biological documentation and assume we're offering them information. Good, Alina had said. Alina, the bioethicist had set down her coffee. We're showing them how much pain humans can endure. We are handing an occupying force a document that says here is the threshold you'll need to exceed. I need to understand why that's not catastrophic. Alina had looked at her for a moment. Because they'll study the threshold, she said, instead of testing it. The room had been very quiet after that. By day 30, Arch Commander Den had a new problem, and this one wouldn't file neatly into any report category. The humans in the processing centers were cooperative, compliant. They answered questions, followed instructions, reported to assigned locations. 0 incidents, 0 resistance. In 30 days of occupation across 63 cities, the Dominion had recorded exactly no acts of violence from any human being. This should have been reassuring. It was, instead, the most frightening thing Den had encountered in 14 years of Dominion expansion operations. He'd occupied 17 worlds. On all 17, there had been resistance within the first week, riots, sabotage, individual acts of desperation. On 3 of the worlds, those acts of resistance had been suicidal, biologically irrational, tactically pointless, and they had happened anyway because that was what living things did when they felt cornered. They fought, even when fighting was fatal, even when the math said don't. Humans were not fighting. Humans were not cornered. Den pulled the interview records for the past 30 days and read them consecutively for the first time, looking for a pattern rather than individual data points. He read for 6 hours. Then he walked to his window and looked out at the city below, where humans moved through their daily routines with an equanimity that he had been interpreting as acceptance. He called his aide. Get me the full file on those communications network shutdowns, the distributed operation, every detail we have. Sir, that analysis concluded. I know what it concluded. Get me everything anyway. The aide returned with the file in 20 minutes. Den read it. Then he read the medical record analysis. Then he read every anomaly, low priority flag that Velsath and 100 other procurement officers had logged in the first 3 weeks. The needle in the wall. The cleared landing zones. The woman who had said, the ones that would have mattered. 300,000 people who had trained for a specific task and then dissolved back into the population as though they'd never done it. Den sat in silence for a very long time. Then he sent a message, classified above his own clearance level, directly to Fleet Admiral HFY. Admiral, request immediate command level conference. I believe we have made a significant error in our assessment. I believe the humans allowed us to land. I believe this was not surrender. He stared at the message for a moment before sending it. I believe we are inside something. I do not yet know what. The conference happened within the hour, and it went badly in a specific way that Den had not anticipated. HFY listened. The senior staff listened. They reviewed the evidence he laid out, the shutdowns, the records, the cleared zones, the total absence of resistance, and they arrived at the same conclusion he had. It was deliberate. The humans had planned this. Where they diverged from Den was in what that meant. They're stalling, said the fleet's chief strategic officer, a compact being named Rusvel who had never lost a campaign in 30 years and was not about to let a primitive species change that record. They let us in without resistance because fighting us in space or on landing was not survivable. They're buying time while they attempt to organize underground resistance. It's tactically rational. I've been looking for underground resistance for 30 days, Den said. I have found nothing. Which means they're better at hiding than we expected. Or there's nothing to find. Den. Rusvel's tone became careful in the way that meant I'm about to say something you should hear. If there's nothing to find, then the humans cooperated with occupation for no tactical reason, which means either they're not as intelligent as the evidence suggests, or their tactical reasoning operates on a different frame than ours, Den said. Rusvel was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, accelerate the integration timeline. I want compliance infrastructure in all 63 cities within 2 weeks. Reduce it to 45 days total occupation before we transition to administrative phase. Den said nothing. He left the conference and returned to his office and sat with his headache and the growing, sourceless, impossible-to-file feeling that something was watching them from underground. He was not wrong. He was just wrong about the scale. 43 days into the occupation, Faris solved the language problem. He'd been working on it for 11 months total, since before the Dominion arrived, since before anyone knew for certain that the invasion was coming, back when the plan was still being built from fragments and worst-case scenarios, and the stubborn refusal of a small group of people to accept that there was no option besides surrender. The Dominion communicated primarily in what their own linguistics classified as a harmonic layered dialect, meaning words carried simultaneous primary and secondary meanings, and fluency required the ability to parse both in real time. Humanity's AI translation tools had cracked the primary layer within weeks of intercepting the Dominion's signals during their approach. The secondary layer was what had remained opaque. Faris, sitting on a folding cot underground with duct-taped glasses, and a stack of notebooks that had become increasingly chaotic over 11 months, solved the secondary layer using a method that Dominion linguists later described, in a classified report, as structurally impossible for a non-native speaker without multi-year immersion. He hadn't had years. He'd had 11 months and a neurological quirk, a form of synesthesia that meant he perceived language patterns as spatial relationships rather than sequential data, and a very particular kind of obsession that his former university colleagues had called his greatest flaw, and that had turned out, finally, to be the most important thing about him. "I've got it," he said, and his voice was so flat and strange that Alina looked up immediately. "All of it." "Enough." He held up the notebook. Secondary layer is positional encoding. The meaning changes based on which prior sentence the speaker was referencing when they produced the new sentence. It's not a dialect. It's a recursive structure, once you know the recursion rules. Faris, we can hear what they're actually saying to each other. He set the notebook down. His hands were trembling very slightly. Not what they're saying to us, what they're saying to each other. Alina stood up. The chamber felt smaller than it had a moment ago, and she wasn't sure if that was fear or something that might become hope if she let it. "Can you teach it?" she asked. "I've already written the primer." He pushed a second notebook toward her across the cot. "But Alina, there's something in the intercepts you need to hear first. Something they said on day 1 in secondary layer that nobody on our side understood." He found the page. Read it aloud, translating as he went. Signals Team Report. The primitive species appears to have disabled its own communications infrastructure voluntarily. Analysis. This may indicate internal factional conflict. Alternatively, analysis. They may have expected us. Recommendation from Signal's lead secondary channel. If they expected us, determine what else they prepared. This recommendation was not passed to command. Alina stared at him. The signals team knew, she said, on day one. Someone on the signals team knew, or suspected, and someone above them decided not to tell the Admiral. Why would they? Because it was easier, Forrest said quietly. Easier to believe we surrendered than to believe we didn't. Easier to file it as low priority and move on. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. Alina, you built this plan around the assumption that they'd underestimate us because they wanted to. That arrogance would do our work for us. He paused. You were right, but it's not just arrogance. It's institutional arrogance, systemic. The people who noticed the anomalies got filtered out of the decision chain. That's a vulnerability, Alina said. That's a very, very serious vulnerability, Forrest agreed. She looked at the notebook for a long moment, then she picked it up. How long to teach this to the team? A week, maybe less, for the people with language backgrounds. Start tonight. The third misinterpretation was the worst, because it was the one the Dominion never fully recovered from. Day 51. A Dominion logistics officer named Prexhan discovered that the human food distribution records left in the city administration buildings were wrong. Not falsified. The humans had not lied, but structured in a way that assumed a future Prexhan initially could not parse. The records documented food stores and distribution routes for a population roughly 30% larger than the number of humans currently accounted for in the 63 cities. Prexhan's first thought, there are more humans than we've counted. This was correct. His second thought, they're hiding in the wilderness, in rural areas outside the cities. The unaccounted for population represents refugees who fled before our arrival. This was catastrophically wrong. He filed his report. Roosevelt dispatched survey teams to rural areas across 4 continents. The teams found scattered small communities, farmers, isolated settlements, and cataloged them. They found no evidence of organized military presence, no weapons caches, no fortified positions. The rural human population was, by every measurable metric, exactly what it appeared to be. Prexhan was given a commendation for identifying the discrepancy. He accepted it. He did not understand that the discrepancy was real, that his first instinct had been entirely correct, and that the 30% of humans currently unaccounted for were underground, not in the wilderness, not hiding in forests or mountains, beneath the cities themselves. The infrastructure beneath humanity's urban centers, subway systems, maintenance tunnels, old Cold War civil defense networks, utility corridors, natural cave systems that had been quietly integrated into the urban underground over decades, constituted, if you unfolded it and laid it flat, an area larger than most of the Dominion's member planets had ever thought to map. Humanity had been mapping it for 8 months, improving it, stocking it, running power to it from geothermal taps that looked, on any surface scan, like ordinary geological activity. Alina's chamber in Spain was one of 4,216 similar chambers currently occupied and operational across 6 continents. The word for what the Dominion had walked into did not exist in Dominion languages, primary or secondary layer. The closest equivalent, Forrest would later explain, was a term from Dominion military history describing a situation where an army realizes too late that the battlefield it chose was not a battlefield at all, but a closing trap. But Forrest didn't explain that yet. That came later, when there was someone from the Dominion worth explaining it to. Day 67. The power fluctuations in the regional grid, the ones carrying encoded signals to resistance chambers across Europe, were noticed by a Dominion infrastructure analyst named Velsath, the same Velsath who had found the needle in the wall. He had not stopped thinking about the needle. He flagged the power fluctuations and brought them to his superior, who sent them to a signals specialist, who ran them through 3 analytical frameworks and found nothing statistically consistent with load variance, nothing actionable. Velsath pulled the raw data himself and stared at it for 4 hours. Something about the pattern felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He tried to explain it to the signals specialist. "It's too consistent," he said. "Load variance is chaotic. This is consistent in its inconsistency. Like," he paused, trying to find the right framing, "like something that's trying to look random but was designed by a mind that found randomness difficult." "You're describing human error," the specialist said. "Their infrastructure is poorly managed." "Or I'm describing a code," Velsath said. The specialist looked at him for a moment. "Log it as a secondary flag," she said. "We'll revisit if it escalates." Velsath logged it. He also quietly began mapping every power fluctuation event he could find across the continental grid. It took him 19 days. What he found, the spatial distribution of anomalies, their timing, their frequency, sketched an outline so large that when he finally placed it over a map of the underground infrastructure surveys, his hand stopped moving. They were everywhere. The signals, the chambers, the underground network, tens of thousands of locations, not hiding from the Dominion. Waiting. He wrote a report, a very long, very careful, very frightened report. He submitted it through official channels. He marked it urgent. He marked it high priority. He added a personal note to the header which was not standard procedure and which read, "I found a needle in a wall on day 3 and I logged it as low priority. I am asking you, please, do not make that same mistake with this report." Rusvel never saw the report. It was reviewed by a mid-level administrator who noted that the analysis was speculative, the evidence circumstantial, and that the author had a history of flagging anomalies that turned out to be nothing. The report was filed, categorized as anxiety-driven overanalysis, low actionability. Velsath received confirmation that his report had been received and processed. He read the categorization. He sat in his office for a long time. Then he did something that was not standard procedure, that was not in his job description, and that would later be described in Dominion records as the only truly rational act performed by any member of the occupation force during the entire campaign. He went to find Archcommander Den. "They're underground," Velsath said, without preamble, placing his map on Den's desk. "Tens of thousands of locations. The power fluctuations are signals. They're communicating. They've been communicating this entire time, and we've been walking over them for 2 months without knowing." Den looked at the map. He looked at it for a very long time. The headache behind his eyes, which had never fully gone away, tightened into something acute. "How many?" he asked. "I estimate conservatively that between 25 and 30% of the total human population is currently underground and undetected." Velsath's voice was steady in the way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. "The food distribution records discrepancy. That was them. That was the number that's missing. They didn't flee to the wilderness. They went down." Den said nothing. "Commander," Velsath leaned forward. "They planned this before we arrived. The infrastructure improvements, the supplies, the signal system, this took months. They knew we were coming. They let us land. They put their people underground and they let us land, and we have been administering the surface of a planet for 2 months while the people we thought we were administering are beneath our feet," Den said quietly. "Watching us, learning our patterns, waiting for something." Velsath straightened. "What are they waiting for?" Den didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the map, and he was thinking about the woman in the interview room who had said, the ones that would have mattered with such careful precision, and the medical records that documented the upper limit of human endurance, and a cold, open message sent from a species facing conquest that read, "We've been expecting something like you." "They're waiting," Den said slowly, "until they understand us completely." Velsath stared at him. "Sir." The communications shut down, the records, the cooperative interviews, the cleared landing zones. Den stood, walked to the window, Every single thing they've done since we arrived has given us information, and everything we've done since we arrived has given them information. We assumed we were the ones collecting data on a new subject. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. We are the subject. We have been the subject from the beginning. Below in the city, humans move through their daily routines, cooperative, calm, patient. Velsath, Din said. How long have they had to learn our communication systems? 67 days of direct exposure, plus whatever they gathered from our approach broadcasts before landing. 6 months minimum total intercept time. And their linguistic capability. We don't fully know. We've assumed limited. Based on the speed of their response to our initial broadcasts, their translation ability was assessed as basic. We assumed, Den said, we didn't test. Sir, if they've cracked our secondary communication layer. They both went very still. If the humans had broken the secondary layer, they hadn't just been observing the Dominion for 67 days. They had been listening to everything, every command decision, every supply route, every tactical discussion between Russ Vel and his officers, conducted in secondary layer specifically because the humans weren't supposed to be able to understand it. Every argument about when to transition to administrative phase, every debate about where the actual military concern lay, every moment the Dominion's command structure had been confident enough to speak freely. We have to assume they know our entire operational posture, Din said. The silence that followed was the most frightened Velsath had ever been in his career, because Din's voice, when he'd said it, hadn't sounded like a man arriving at a tactical problem. He'd sounded like a man arriving at the edge of something and realizing he couldn't see the bottom. Velsath, Din said, get me Admiral Vor. Now, override Rusvel's access if you have to. Tell her the word I used in my message on day 30. Sorry. Tell her inside. Tell her I know now what we're inside. The signal that Alina received on day 71 was not a power fluctuation. It was a voice. Faris, sitting at the modified receiver they'd built over 9 weeks from salvaged components, looked up with an expression that Alina had never seen on him before, something between scholarly excitement and pure animal fear. They're calling for you, he said. They don't know I exist. They know someone like you exists. He handed her the headset. Secondary layer, they said, to whoever is running the human operation underground, we want to talk. Alina held the headset for a moment. She was thinking about a room 8 months ago, and a bioethicist asking I need to understand why that's not catastrophic asterisk, and her own answer, which she'd been so certain of at the time, and which now, in the close geothermal dark 40 meters underground, felt like something she'd said in a different life. Because they'll study the threshold instead of testing it. She put on the headset. This is Vasquez, she said, in Dominion primary layer, which she'd learned to speak acceptably in the past 60 days. Then, very carefully in secondary layer, drawing on Faris's primer and 6 weeks of intensive practice. And before you say anything else, I want you to know we can hear you clearly. Both layers. We've been able to for some time. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Then a voice she would come to know as Den said, in a tone she recognized because she'd spent her entire military career learning to recognize it. The tone of someone who has just understood something terrible and is choosing to stay calm anyway. How long? 23 days of fluency, she said. 6 days of full operational comprehension. Another silence. You heard the command conferences. Yes. The supply route discussions. Yes. The timeline for administrative transition. Yes, she paused. We were going to let you reach day 90. That was the original plan, 90 days of surface administration before we presented ourselves. But your analyst, the one you sent to find me, he's good. He found the signal pattern. We moved the timeline up. Why? Din asked. Alina thought about the medical records stacked in the hospitals, the needle in the wall, placed at exactly chest height, the 300,000 people who had learned a specific skill and dissolved back into ordinary life, the 4,000 chambers, the underground world that had been built and stocked and powered, while the Dominion walked overhead and called it a compliant planet. "Because we didn't want you to be frightened," she said. "We wanted you to understand there's a difference." Vasquez, his voice had changed. Something in it that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it in a way that no Dominion officer would have easily admitted. "What is it that you actually want?" She reached out and touched the stone wall of the chamber. Cold, solid, 40 meters of human planning above her and 2 months of something unprecedented below. "We want to negotiate," she said, "on equal terms, which we couldn't do from the surface because on the surface you had all the leverage. Down here," she paused, "down here it's different." "You're threatening us from underground," Den said slowly. "No," she was quiet for a moment. "We're showing you that we could have. That for 71 days we could have done a great many things we chose not to do, and that we made that choice not because we couldn't, but because we decided that what comes after the occupation matters more than the occupation itself." She heard him breathing. "There are 4,000 chambers," she said quietly, 28% of our total population, supplied for 18 months. They go from underground power grid to underground power grid on systems your surface scans can't distinguish from geological noise. Your administrative transition assumes a pacified population. Commander. She let that sit for exactly one breath. Your administrative transition assumes a surface. The line was very quiet. "What do you want?" he asked again, and this time the question was entirely different. Not the strategic question of an occupying officer, but the human question almost of someone trying to understand something that kept refusing to be understood. "I want to go upstairs," Alina said. "I want to sit at a table with your Admiral. I want to show her what we built and what we chose not to use, and then I want to have a conversation about what a species that can do that is actually worth to the Dominion as a member, not a territory." Another silence, longer. "She'll want proof," Den said. "Tell her to look at the power grid in her city. Tell her to ask her infrastructure team why 32% of the nodes show variance patterns that can't be explained by load." Alina stood up. She looked at Faris, at Kowalski, at the 11 people who had been underground for 71 days and had not once questioned whether it was worth it. "Tell her I'll turn them all off at once so she can see the shape of them when they go dark. Tell her to count them." She paused. "And tell her we left the hospitals stocked. We kept the water running. We cleared the landing zones." She touched the headset one last time. "We didn't do that because we were afraid of you. We did that because we'd already decided what kind of relationship we wanted to have, and we were willing to spend 71 days underground to get to the table where we could ask for it." She took the headset off. Faris was staring at her. "Do you think it worked?" "I think," Alina said slowly, "that it worked the moment they landed." The geothermal vent hummed. Somewhere above them, in a city full of patient, cooperative, impossible humans, a Dominion officer was picking up a comm line to call his Admiral and trying to find words for something his language, primary or secondary layer, had not needed to describe before. A civilization that had engineered its own invasion. A species that had handed an occupying force a planet so smoothly, so carefully, so completely that the occupation had become a demonstration, not of human weakness, but of human will. That had built an entire underground world not as a last resort, but as a negotiating position. That had placed a needle in a wall at chest height, at 11,000 locations, as a marker, a signal, a message left for the species that would eventually understand it. We were here, we were watching, we knew what we were doing. 3 days later, Alina Vasquez walked up 40 meters of stone stairs, into the Spanish morning, and shook hands with an admiral who had run 22 successful invasions, and had never, in any of them, sat across from the people she'd been invading and been asked, not told, not forced, asked to treat them as equals. Vor looked at her for a long time across the table. Outside the window, the city was the same as it had always been, intact, powered, running, and that now meant something completely different than it had 74 days ago. "You could have fought us," the Admiral said finally. "It wasn't a question." "We could have tried," Alina said. "We chose not to. There's a difference." Vor was quiet. She looked out the window. Somewhere in the city's grid, 32% of the nodes had gone dark for exactly 45 seconds 2 days ago, all at once, like a pattern emerging from noise. And when her infrastructure team had mapped the negative space, the shape that the silence made, the Admiral had sat in her office for a very long time before she was ready to have this conversation. The shape had been a word, in Dominion script, written in the power grid of a human city using lights they'd tapped without anyone knowing, because they'd been watching and learning and preparing for 8 months before the first ship arrived. The word was hello. "I've been asking," Vor said slowly, "what you are. What kind of species does this, builds this, waits like this?" She turned from the window. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that would stay behind them for the rest of her life. "I don't have an answer yet." Alina nodded. "That's okay," she said. "We're patient." And somewhere beneath 63 cities across 6 continents, 4,216 chambers sat quiet and stocked and dark, their work complete, their inhabitants climbing toward the surface one by one, not because the plan had succeeded, but because something much longer and stranger and more important than a plan had just begun. The Dominion would spend years afterward trying to classify what humanity had done. They never quite managed it. Because the categories they had, surrender, resistance, negotiation, subterfuge, all assumed that a species, when faced with overwhelming force, was trying to survive it. Humanity had not been trying to survive the invasion. They had been trying to change what invasion meant. And they had done it not with weapons, not with technology, not with some evolutionary gift that made them stronger or faster or harder to kill, but with the one thing no Dominion strategic model had ever thought to account for: the willingness to go underground for 71 days, in cold stone chambers with cheese-flavored protein bars and duct-taped glasses, and wait, patiently, purposefully, for the moment when the species that had come to own them was finally ready to hear the word *hello. There is a record in Dominion archives, sealed at the highest classification, accessible only to senior command, that documents the final assessment of Earth's incorporation attempt. It runs to 640 pages. The final line, written by Archcommander Den and approved unedited by Admiral Vor, reads as follows: "We came to this planet prepared for every response a civilization might have to conquest. We were not prepared for a civilization that had decided, long before we arrived, that conquest itself was simply the first sentence of a conversation they intended to finish on their own terms. Humanity is not the strongest species we have encountered. They are the only species we have encountered who had already decided that strength was the wrong tool for what they were trying to build. We recommend immediate reclassification of Earth status. We also recommend that whoever reads this understands. They were ready for us before we were ready for ourselves. They are still waiting."